Adrian Leclerc had built an empire out of lines of code, acquisitions, and an almost inhuman capacity for focus, the sort of focus that could turn an obscure software startup into a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate in less than a decade, the sort of focus that saw no real difference between a business plan and a battlefield. But long before the private jets, the speaking engagements, the guarded invitations to Davos and G20 summits, there had been a single afternoon in his 19-year-old life that he could neither forget nor repay. An afternoon that began with the innocent recklessness of youth and ended with the cold, black panic of drowning. He had been traveling in West Africa on a self-styled adventure gap year. Not because he was wealthy, back then he was anything but because he was restless, convinced that the world's edges held truths that no classroom could teach him. He had been trekking along the Ghanaian coast, camera slung over his shoulder, cheap canvas shoes caked in the red earth of the coastal trails, when the skies darkened with the kind of sudden tropical violence that feels less like weather and more like a judgment. The river he had been idly photographing from a ridge had swelled into a frothing, snarling force, and when the bank beneath his feet gave way, he had only time to register the sensation of falling before the water swallowed him whole. What followed was chaos, shouts in a language he barely understood, the battering slap of water against his face, the sick pull of current dragging him down, and then through the blur, the pressure of two strong hands gripping his arms, a body angled against the current, and the urgent, almost desperate pull toward the muddy safety of the bank. She couldn't have been more than 16 or 17, slender but wiry, with skin gleaming dark against the rain, and eyes full of something that, in his haze, looked like fierce annoyance that he'd been foolish enough to fall in. She had wrapped him in a threadbare blanket, spoken a name he thought sounded like Amma, though his ears were full of water, and stayed beside him until villagers arrived. The next day, when he returned with the vague hope of saying thank you, she was gone and no one seemed to know, or perhaps no one was willing to tell him, where she had gone. For years afterward, the memory lingered not as a romantic fantasy, but as a debt. His survival had been bought with her effort, and though she had taken nothing in return, he felt the weight of what he owed her. Life swept him forward. College, a startup launched from a rented apartment, the intoxicating vertigo of sudden wealth when his code caught the wave of a digital revolution. And for a while, the memory dimmed under the glare of success. But as the years passed, as the noise of victory quieted into the low hum of routine, the thought began to press harder. Somewhere in the world was a woman who had pulled him back from the edge of death, and he had let her vanish. One late night, staring out from the 85th floor of his Manhattan office at a city glittering like a circuit board, he decided that would no longer be the case. The search began with a single phone call to a private investigator, which turned into a web of inquiries stretching across continents. He hired ex-Interpol officers, local fixers, data analysts skilled in cross-referencing obscure birth registries with old-school rosters. He purchased access to immigration and census archives under shell companies, sponsored philanthropic missions to villages along the Ghanaian coast that were as much about building wells as they were about gathering oral histories, and offered cash rewards to anyone who could produce a photograph, a record, even a whisper of a girl named Amma, who had lived by the river 20 years ago. Leads trickled in: a church ledger from 2004, a tattered school notebook with a similar name, a grainy photograph in the background of a charity's annual report. Each one made his pulse quicken, and each one collapsed under scrutiny into disappointment. The budget, at first a casual indulgence, began to climb. $500,000, then $3 million, then 10, and Adrian hardly noticed, because in his mind there was no price for settling a moral debt. His friends laughed at the idea, calling it his ghost hunt. His board grew uneasy at the diversion of his attention, though the companies continued to run at a profit. 15 years passed this way, the search stretching into something between a penance and a compulsion. By the time the amount spent crossed $35 million, the machinery of the hunt had become vast. A central office in Geneva coordinating field teams in Africa, Europe, and North America, satellite imagery requests funneled through third-party contractors, informants paid in wads of cash in unlit backrooms. Adrian told himself, each time a lead fizzled, that the next one could be her. He imagined finding her, imagined the conversation, the moment of recognition, the chance to tell her she had not been forgotten. In quieter moments, when the fantasy loosened its grip, he admitted to himself that maybe she didn't want to be found, that maybe she had moved on, that maybe the boy she had saved was nothing more than a faint shadow in her memory. But the doubt never lasted. Somewhere he was sure Amma was out there, and he was willing to scour the world to bring her back into the light. While Adrian's investigators hopped across continents, chasing whispers and false sightings, his own life was rooted in an estate so vast and curated that it seemed less a home than a private ecosystem. The LeClaire residence sprawled across 200 acres of manicured countryside in upstate New York, an architectural statement of glass walls, steel beams, and imported marble floors polished to a mirrored sheen. It had its own internal climate controls, so precise that orchids thrived year-round in the atrium, and a kitchen large enough to feed a banquet, yet quiet enough most days to hear the faint hum of the refrigerator. Staff kept the machine of his daily life, running like a well-oiled code base. Chefs who crafted his meals down to the perfect seasoning balance, gardeners who shaped the grounds with an almost artistic discipline, and housekeepers who moved like discreet shadows through the corridors, ensuring every surface remained immaculate. Among them was a maid named Naomi, a woman in her mid-30s with an unassuming presence and a rhythm of work so efficient she seemed almost invisible. She arrived early each morning in a plain uniform, hair tucked neatly beneath a scarf, eyes lowered in a manner that discouraged unnecessary conversation. She was neither timid nor unfriendly. Rather, she occupied that careful professional space where service staff live, present enough to anticipate needs, absent enough to never intrude. To Adrian, she was simply one of many, a name occasionally glimpsed on a payroll summary or a brief staff roster sent to his assistant. In the 3 years she had worked for him, their interactions rarely extended beyond a polite nod or a perfunctory thank you when she set down a fresh cup of coffee in his study. He never wondered where she went when she left the estate each evening, never asked why her accent carried a soft, lilting cadence that didn't quite match any American region, never noticed how she sometimes lingered for a fraction of a second when her eyes swept over him, as if searching for something familiar. For Naomi, the estate was just another stop in a long chain of jobs, cleaning for wealthy families, managing the endless repetition of dusting, scrubbing, laundering, and polishing. But in the quiet of her mind, she carried the memory of a younger man, half-drowned and gasping, whose eyes had met hers with raw terror and gratitude on the banks of a swollen river an ocean away. She had never spoken of it to anyone in the house. What would be the point? The boy from that day had vanished into the tide of his own life, just as she had vanished into hers. If she suspected that the man she worked for might be that boy grown older, richer, and harder around the edges, she dismissed it, because the man she saw now barely saw her at all. He lived surrounded by beauty, wealth, and a small army of employees. Yet his gaze passed through her as though she were part of the wallpaper. And so, day after day, while Adrian poured fortunes into his search for the girl who had saved him, the woman he sought quietly polished his floors, replaced his empty coffee cup, and disappeared from his awareness the moment she stepped out of the room. It was in early spring, when the thawing air carried that faint smell of wet soil and possibility, that Adrian's search team delivered the kind of news that jolted him out of the numb rhythm of false leads and bureaucratic dead ends. He had been in his Manhattan office, a room with floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking a river whose calm surface always felt like a mockery of the one that had nearly taken him, when his lead investigator, a grizzled ex-Interpol officer named Marceau, called with a voice threaded with restrained excitement. They had found her, or someone who could very well be her. A woman in her late 30s, living in a modest town outside Toronto, matched the physical description cobbled together from the fragments of Adrian's 20-year-old memory and the bits of witness testimony gathered in Ghana. Her name, astonishingly, was Amakwami, and she had once lived in a coastal village not far from the very riverbank where Adrian had been pulled to safety. There were no photographs from her youth to confirm it, But Marceau's team had interviewed two older women who swore they remembered Amma mentioning a foreign boy she had rescued during a storm. The details were fuzzy, blurred by the passing years, but it was enough to make Adrian's heart thunder in his chest and to make him abandon the stack of documents he had been reviewing without a second thought. Within hours, his Gulfstream was fueled and ready, slicing through the pale morning sky toward Canada, his mind rehearsing what he would say when they met. How he would thank her. How he would tell her that not a year, not a month had passed without him remembering her courage. How he would make sure her life was made easier from that day forward. He imagined her recognition, the smile of surprise, the shared weight of a story they both had carried alone. By the time his car rolled down a quiet suburban street lined with bare maples, the fantasy had taken root so deeply that he barely noticed the ordinariness of the house they stopped at, a modest one-story home with peeling paint on the porch railing. When Alma opened the door, she looked at him with polite confusion, the guarded wariness of someone unaccustomed to billionaires showing up unannounced. Her skin was the right shade, her build similar, her age plausible. He studied her eyes, dark kind, but not the exact shade that had seared itself into his drowning boy's memory. Still, he pushed forward, explaining who he was, why he was there, recounting the river, the storm, the rescue. She listened without interruption, her face unreadable, and when he finished, she shook her head gently. "I'm sorry," she said in lightly accented English. "It wasn't me. I have never been to that river. Maybe you have the wrong Amma." Marceau pressed her politely on the villager's testimony, but she insisted the rescue story she had told years ago was secondhand, something she had repeated from a friend's experience, not her own. There was no flicker of recognition in her eyes, no shared memory waiting to surface. Adrian felt the hollow weight in his chest grow heavier with each passing second. They stayed for tea out of courtesy, but by the time they left, he knew. This was not her. Back in the jet, staring out at the shrinking cityscape below, he felt a dull ache in the place where hope had been burning so hotly just hours earlier. Yet the machinery of the search did not stop. Weeks later, another lead surfaced, this time a woman in London, a nurse whose younger self bore a resemblance to the girl in his mind's eye. He flew there, too, walking into a tiny flat with the same brittle optimism, only to find another polite stranger shaking her head. Then Sierra Leone, where a fisherman's daughter fit, a piece of the puzzle. Then the Caribbean, where a community elder swore a woman named Amma had once told her a story of pulling a foreigner from the water. Each time, the journey ended the same: a face that almost matched, a story that almost fit, and then the quiet, crushing collapse of the almost into nothing. The $35 million spent on the search by that point might have bought a chain of hospitals or funded scholarships for thousands. But to Adrian, it was simply the cost of keeping the promise he had made silently to himself on that stormy afternoon decades ago. His friends, what few he had left who weren't drawn to him by business interests, began to make comments that carried the edge of concern. One suggested he might be chasing a ghost, another half joked that perhaps the girl had grown into a woman who wanted nothing to do with him. His CFO, a man allergic to sentiment, reminded him in a quarterly review that the charitable initiatives masking parts of his search expenditures were bleeding money without measurable impact. Adrian barely listened. The point was not efficiency, not even certainty. It was persistence. Each dead lead was a bruise, but each also sharpened his resolve, because if so many women could almost be her, then surely, somewhere, one would be her exactly. And all the while, as private jets and encrypted calls and hushed negotiations in back rooms carried his search across continents, Naomi continued moving silently through the marble halls of his estate, dusting the glass shelves in his study, polishing the silver in the dining room, setting his coffee exactly as he liked it. On days when he returned from yet another failed lead, eyes shadowed with disappointment, she would notice the tension in his shoulders, the distracted way he moved, but say nothing. She had learned long ago that silence was the most valued currency in houses like his. Sometimes, in the privacy of her small apartment, she would catch sight of herself in the mirror and think of the boy on the riverbank. The way his lips had turned blue, The heaviness of his body as she dragged him up the muddy slope, the way he had looked at her as though she were the only thing in the world tethering him to life. She never connected that boy to the man she now worked for. The gulf between them seemed too wide, the transformation too complete. And so the dance continued, Adrian chasing her ghost across the globe, Naomi living quietly within the walls of his home, each unaware, or perhaps unwilling to believe, that the other had been there all along. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of overcast day when the sky seemed reluctant to commit to rain, hanging instead in a low, oppressive gray that made the glass walls of Adrian's study reflect his own figure back at him. He had been pacing for an hour, restless, the latest report from Marceau's team lying open on his desk like a half-read indictment. Another false lead. This time, the photograph they'd sent him was of a smiling woman in Accra, seated beside a market stall piled high, with cassava roots and mangoes, her head wrapped in a patterned scarf. Her name, too, was Amma, and her story bore enough echoes of his own memory that he had boarded a plane to Ghana without hesitation. But after 3 days in the city, 2 awkward interviews, and 1 translator's apologetic shrug, he had come home again empty-handed. His jet had landed in the early hours of the morning, and though the estate staff had been told to give him space, Naomi had still prepared his study, dusting the shelves, replacing the water in the vase by the window, laying out the documents from his absence before he arrived. Now, as he ran a hand through his hair and stared down at the printed pages of Marceau's latest negative confirmation, his temper got the better of him. He reached for his coffee, the last thing tethering him to the idea that this day might yet be salvaged, and in the jerking motion of flipping a page, he knocked the cup sideways. The liquid spread quickly across the polished walnut, bleeding into the corners of paper, seeping toward the small frame that stood nearest the desk's edge. It was the only personal photograph he kept in the study, a sun-faded image taken with a cheap disposable camera on his gap year, showing him, tanned and skinny, squinting into the bright light beside a fishing boat with peeling blue paint. He had never looked closely at the background in years. The photo was simply a relic of the trip and of the storm that had defined it. But now, as the frame slid, tipped, and landed face down on the carpet with a muted thud, Adrian cursed under his breath and bent to retrieve it just as the door opened, and Naomi stepped in with a cloth in one hand and the calm efficiency of someone accustomed to cleaning up after other people's mistakes. She crossed the room in 3 quick steps, knelt to blot the spreading stain on the desk, and in doing so, glanced at the photo in his hand. For the briefest second, her movements stilled. Her eyes, usually lowered in deference, locked onto the small rectangle of glossy paper. The expression that flickered across her face was not the blank professionalism he was used to. It was something sharper, something that carried the weight of recognition. Adrian noticed, though he didn't yet understand, and without quite knowing why, he asked, "What?" Naomi seemed to collect herself in an instant, but her voice, when she spoke, was softer than usual, edged with something almost wistful. "That was the day before the storm," she said, and the words landed in the room with a strange gravity, as though they had been waiting years to be spoken. Adrian's brow furrowed. "The storm," he echoed, straightening slowly. She nodded once, eyes still on the photograph. "The storm," she said again, more firmly this time, and then after a beat she added, "The river. You were drowning." The air in the room seemed to thin. Adrian's mind raced through a dozen possibilities, misunderstanding, coincidence, some fluke of shared memory. But none of them explained the way his pulse had started to hammer in his ears. I'm sorry," he said carefully. "What do you mean?" Naomi's gaze met his fully for the first time in years, and he was startled to find a steadiness there, as if she had long ago made peace with a truth that was only now dawning on him. "I pulled you out," she said simply. "You were a boy. You'd fallen in, and the current," she trailed off, her expression unreadable. "I thought you knew." For a long, suspended moment, Adrian could only stare at her, the pieces of the puzzle rearranging themselves with brutal clarity. The curve of her cheek, the line of her jaw, the small, pale scar near her left temple. How had he not seen it before? In his mind, the years peeled away. The wiry teenage girl, rain slicking her braids against her head, the urgent strength in her grip as she hauled him toward the muddy slope. And now, here she was, standing in his study, a cloth still in her hand, a maid he had barely acknowledged for 3 years. His voice was barely more than a whisper. "Naomi, it was you?" She gave a faint, almost embarrassed smile, the kind one gives when stating something obvious. "I thought you recognized me the first week I worked here," she said. "You looked right at me that day on the river. I didn't think you'd forget." The words landed heavier than he expected. He sank into the leather chair behind him, the photo still in his grip, his mind trying to reconcile the absurdity of it all. 15 years of searching, $35 million spent, entire corners of the world combed over, and the woman he had been hunting had been dusting his shelves every Tuesday and Thursday without so much as a nod from him beyond the perfunctory. "I've been looking for you," he said, finally, the confession coming out almost childlike. "For years, all over the world, and you've been here." Naomi set the cloth down and straightened. "People miss what's right in front of them all the time," she said gently. "You were busy." He wanted to protest, to tell her that busy didn't begin to explain it, but the truth was too damning. He had looked through her 100 times, never once wondering who she was beyond the role she played in his household. The realization brought a flush of shame to his face. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked. She shrugged, a small, pragmatic movement. "What would I have said? Remember me? I saved your life? Maybe you wouldn't have believed me. Maybe you didn't want to be reminded." There was no bitterness in her tone, only a kind of measured calm, but it stung nonetheless. He thought of the faces of the women he'd met on his fruitless journeys, the staged conversations, the polite rejections. He thought of the weight of the promise he'd been carrying all these years, the drive that had fueled every mile traveled, every dollar spent. And then he thought of Naomi quietly working in his home, sending money to family overseas, living a life that intersected his everyday without ever touching it in any meaningful way, until now. The rest of the afternoon unfolded in a haze. He asked her questions, where she had gone after the rescue, how she had come to America, what her life had been in the years between. She answered some and let others pass in silence, and he didn't press. When she left the study, the space felt altered, as though its walls now contained not just his possessions, but the living, breathing truth of the debt he had carried for so long. Alone, he picked up the phone to call Marceau, his voice shaking slightly as he told the man to stand down the search. It was over, but as he ended the call and set the phone aside, he understood that over wasn't quite the right word. Finding Naomi didn't erase the years he had spent looking for her, nor did it dissolve the quiet, complicated distance that had existed between them in the very same house. What it did was strip away the illusion that money and willpower could bend the world entirely to one's desires. He had believed, with the certainty of the powerful, that he could find anything if he looked hard enough, that the world was a puzzle waiting for him to solve. Now, sitting in the fading light of his study, he knew better. Sometimes the answer wasn't hiding in some distant corner of the earth. It was standing quietly at your elbow, waiting for you to finally see it. For days after that conversation in the study, the air in the Leclerc estate seemed subtly altered, as if the house itself had overheard the revelation and was now carrying it in its quiet spaces, in the faint echo of footsteps down the hall, in the muted clink of china in the kitchen. Adrian moved through the rooms with a different kind of awareness, his gaze catching on things he had long ignored. The delicate polish of the banister, the neatly aligned silver in the dining cabinet, the faint scent of lavender on freshly laundered linens. All of these were Naomi's invisible fingerprints, the quiet marks of someone who had been caring for his space unnoticed for years. Now, every sight of her brought with it a strange collision of past and present. He would watch her carry a tray through the hall, and for a heartbeat, he would see her as she had been 2 decades ago, rain streaming down her face, eyes fierce with determination as she hauled him up from the river's pool. It unsettled him to realize how easily those two images blended, how little she had truly changed, and how much he had failed to notice. He wanted to make amends, an impulse that for him usually took the shape of transactions, gifts, or grand gestures. But Naomi had an unshakable resistance to the idea of being repaid, When he first offered to set up a trust in her name, she laughed softly and said, "I didn't save you to send you a bill." When he suggested buying her a home, she shook her head, explaining that she was content with her small apartment and the life she had built. In the end, the only thing she agreed to was letting him quietly clear her debts and arrange for regular transfers to her family overseas, an agreement she accepted with a nod and a simple, "Thank you, but that's enough." It was perhaps the first time in years that someone had told him, without malice or awe, that enough was enough. In the weeks that followed, a tentative new rhythm developed between them. She still worked, still polished and dusted and prepared his coffee. But now they spoke, sometimes only for a minute, sometimes longer, and always with the easy cadence of two people feeling out the edges of a shared history. She told him about her childhood in the village, about the day of the storm, how she had been walking home from school when she saw a foreign boy swept into the river. She admitted she had been terrified herself, but couldn't bear to watch him vanish. She spoke of the years that followed, the loss of her parents, the move to the city, the jobs that took her across borders and oceans until she landed, by a twist of circumstance, in his household. He, in turn, told her about the weight of that day in his own mind, the sense of owing a debt that had followed him through every success, every deal, every sleepless night at the top of the corporate world. There were still silences between them, not awkward so much as reflective, like pauses in a piece of music that make the notes around them ring more clearly. Adrian found himself questioning things he had never questioned before. How easily he had dismissed the people who moved through his life in the periphery, how quick he had been to assume that the world's most valuable things could be hunted down with enough money and persistence. The irony of it all was almost absurd. $35 million spent chasing her shadow, and the truth had been here all along, scrubbing his study floor. But beyond the irony was something heavier, something humbling. It forced him to consider the possibility that wealth had blinded him, not just to her, but to countless other lives intersecting quietly with his own. The change did not happen overnight, but it was real. He began greeting the staff by name, noticing their expressions, asking after their families. He started spending more time in spaces he had once treated as mere corridors between obligations, sitting with Naomi in the kitchen while she peeled vegetables, lingering in the garden to watch the groundskeepers work. There was no grand announcement, no cinematic closure to the years of searching, just a slow, steady folding of her presence back into his daily life, this time with his eyes truly open. One evening, months after the unmasking, they stood together on the terrace, the sunset staining the horizon in deep amber. The conversation had wandered from her nephew's schooling to the way the vineyard was coming in this year when Adrian, almost without thinking, said, "I used to imagine finding you would feel like closing a circle. But it's not like that at all. It's more like opening a door I didn't know was there." Naomi looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe some circles aren't meant to close," she said. "Maybe they're meant to keep turning, so you keep learning from them." Her words settled into him with the same quiet weight as her first revelation in the study. He knew then that no amount of money could replicate what he had been given, not the life she had saved, not the chance to see her again, and certainly not the lesson embedded in the way she had lived beside him, unnoticed yet steadfast. Money had built his world, but it had not taught him how to see it. That had come from her, and from the long, winding journey he'd taken to finally recognize her. As the last light faded from the sky, Adrian felt, perhaps for the first time in years, the sharp edge of his restlessness dull into something gentler. The search was over, but the story, their story, was still unfolding, written now not in frantic flights across continents or checks written in haste, but in small, unremarkable moments shared in the same place. And in those moments, he understood in a way he never had before. The most valuable things in life aren't found at the end of a long chase. They are the ones you learn to notice when you finally stop running.